Okay, we should be live now. So welcome to the second episode of the Metabochondriacs. Your two metabochondriac hosts are Dr. Ryan Cooley, probably on the right of your screen, and myself, Brett Smith, on the left. And today we're going to just kind of do a pretty brief topic that is pretty near and dear to, I would say, probably both of us, and probably to you as the audience as well. And that is, why has the world gone the way it has from a health standpoint? And what can we correct in the healthcare system to bring it back to the health that we had a mere 50 years ago, but especially more 80 to 90 years ago? So with that, this is predicated, this conversation, off of a blog from my website. You can see the web address by my name. And it's the bottom blog referring to metabolic therapy to reverse chronic conditions. And it is meant as for people who start applying some of these metabolic health strategies. It hasn't permeated all of primary care or most of specialty care yet either. And it's very possible that you could be getting some blowback from your physician because they don't understand this. And so this blog was written as a way for you to just put a link inside of your electronic medical record, asking your doctor, please review this. I want to come in and create a game plan for about how I can improve my health, not just from a weight standpoint, but let's talk about reversing chronic conditions. And if they're not familiar with this, everything is available for them to do if they want to do a 1 hour or a 50-hour deep dive. They can use that blog as a launching place to understand metabolism and metabolic health. So Ryan, I'm going to pose the first question to you, and then we're just going to go back and forth and play off of each other with all of this. You've obviously made a huge metabolic journey, and people can learn about both of our metabolic journeys in our first episode of the Metabochondriacs on this same channel. But as you kind of, let's say, had your metabolic health awakening, what are some of the things that you see from your patients, and now that you look through the primary care that they're getting their primary care from, what lenses are you seeing that you would say, God, if I could change everything today, what would we do different in primary care?
I think that the number one issue would be the proper diagnosis of metabolic dysfunction. And we throw that term metabolic metabolism around a lot. But the current paradigm, and not that the paradigm is wrong, it's just insufficient. The paradigm is a glucose-centric paradigm, where all we look at is fasting glucose and A1C, which are metrics that become altered very, very late in the game. And so if we want to have the greatest public health impact, we need to be making these diagnoses far earlier than we do. And I think, so it's really insulin centricity, both from the standpoint of diagnosing when there is cellular dysfunction and how our cells and our organs and our body is managing energy, but also how we rectify the problem. I think we've been hampered by this ongoing and 50-year model of calories for weight loss.
150 years.
Well, I don't think it maybe. Yeah, maybe.
Riveter.
I think it started off 150 years ago based on hormones, but it morphed into calorie in, calorie out, and it's been a big disservice. Because you can't, if you just tell somebody to eat less and they go hypocaloric and their insulin is still high, they're going to fail. And I see this every day, every single day in my clinic. People come in and this is what they've been told to. The first thing they say is, well, I need to start exercising more. my doc said I don't exercise enough. And then they say, well, I need to eat less, right? I eat too much. and it's a calorie fixation. It's energy in and energy out, energy expenditures. It's this calorie and energy balance fixation that just doesn't work. And I see it every day. You've got to first focus on the insulin. You've got to get the insulin down so that the body can manage energy coming in. It's as simple as that. So I think that's, at the level of both primary care, but also specialty care. It's educating our colleagues about this issue, and it's insulin centricity, both on the standpoint of diagnosing, but also as a therapy. The end, when I plot out for my patients the road to metabolic recovery, at the very end, it's not a weight, it's not this or that, it's insulin sensitivity, which means that their insulin levels are normal, fasting, and including response to certain macronutrients. That's the key. That is ultimately the key, because insulin resistance associates with every chronic disease there is, practically every chronic disease there is. And, the other thing I see in my clinic with, I'm predominantly an electrophysiologist, so I see mostly arrhythmia problems. The number one arrhythmia we see is atrial fibrillation, and it is 100% a metabolic disease. I mean, yes, there may be some other influences. Perhaps there's some genetics in a particular individual, but by and large, what I uniformly see is a diagnosis of insulin resistance. But you have to look for it. You only know what you look for. And if you don't look for it, you will miss it. A massive amount.
So really, that's one of the main cornerstones of what's missing in primary care is we're like the drunk looking for the keys under the street light, but we lost it a block away, but the light's better over here. We're not looking for the obvious things or where the problems are. And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what is the root cause of what's going on here. And I'm going to just play on that for one quick second. With insulin resistance being the cornerstone of almost all metabolic issues, or chronic conditions are metabolic issues. And we're going to just not cover this today. It's a whole nother one, but it's really mitochondrial dysfunction going on, where you said we can't properly use the energy because of the insulin being so high, but there's a number of other things that are creating that mitochondrial dysfunction beyond just insulin not allowing the fat to get released from the cells and all of the different things going on with that. But where I want to go right now is that, to me, one of the biggest failings of this misunderstanding is that we could cure and reverse so many things before the population is so damaged. It takes anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 years of insulin resistance before it starts manifesting into a symptom that somebody's going to come and see you or a primary care or one of 13 other specialists about. And the biggest problem with that is not only are we allowing things to manifest, and insulin resistance can turn into 13 or 40 different conditions inside of the body if it's left unchecked. But to me, one of the biggest other failings that we have from our whole nutritional guidelines and everything, which 100% plays into this, is that, are you getting Tux in there?
He's
asleep. So, but the thing is because we let it go so long, the population not understanding that it's predominantly from the nutrition side of the insulin resistance equation. It's all the ultra processed foods. It's the breakfast cereals, it's the donuts, it's the cookies, it's the cakes, it's the everything that never used to exist in the diet 100 years ago because it just wasn't there other than the occasional party. And people didn't have the discretionary income to buy it. If it was there, it was only really the wealthy that had the diseases, because they could feed their face with chocolate and cake and Coca-Cola and all the things that the average person couldn't. But the end result of all of this is now we're faced with not just having a population that has 93% of the population not considered metabolically healthy. About half of them are somewhere on the, call it, sugar addiction spectrum. And there's a course I'm taking right now on sugar and food addiction. And it's just so evident that so many people have and suffer from this. But had we caught it in their 20s and early 30s by looking at HOMA-IRs, and we'll get into other things that they can test, because I'd like to also just talk about some insulin testing. But it's such an easy thing to find out and diagnose and allow somebody to correct something that might have been a 5 to 8 to 10 year problem, even though most kids before out of high school are on the path to this right now. But it's so easily reversible, but now you got to contend with the sugar addiction that comes with it. Do you find any of your patients stumbling with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge, very prevalent problem. I'm a self-described sugar addict.
Me too.
Yeah, and what works for me is, and I think what works for a lot of my patients, because this is what I talk about, but it's focusing on satiety. It's focusing on or it's leveraging nutrient density and diet quality. And this has nothing to do with the current nutritional guidelines or the healthy eating index. It's a complete opposite. But
so what you're saying is it has everything to do with the guidelines, and just do the opposite of the guidelines.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you have some good points. I mean, I think that the other thing I would bring up in terms of, there's two other things I'd bring up to you as things I'd like to see change, in our medical clinics. Number one, it's getting rid of the selective focus on LDL cholesterol as the dominant biomarker to manipulate. And that's a minority view, right? The majority view is that the reason we are doing so poorly as a nation, when you look at the sobering statistics of cardiovascular disease risk factors and cardiovascular disease, is because we haven't been driving the LDL-C low enough for long enough. That's the prevailing view, and it's a view that it's not non-contextual. It's context independent, and the major pattern of lipid abnormality that I see in clinics, and I'm sure other people would see it if they just open their eyes to it, is high triglyceride-rich lipoproteins and low HDL. That's the metabolic lipid signature. That's the major problem.
Let me jump on that and throw it right back to you, because most people don't recognize when you say that. When I mention that 93% of America is not considered metabolically healthy, there's 5 aspects to what is referred to as metabolic syndrome that Gerald Revens called in the 70s first. Symptom X or whatever, that they first realized.
Syndrome X.
And then it got turned into being called metabolic syndrome. And it's low HDL. It's high triglyceride. It's high blood pressure. It's high adipose in your waist area. So high, a fat belly. And where was I going with the 5th one in there?
Blood pressure.
I think I said blood pressure, but anyhow, so these 5 things, and I might have left one of them out, but that's where, when I was an undiagnosed metabolic syndrome in the corporate wellness world, I had HDL in the low 20s. I had triglycerides in the 180s. I developed a heck of a belly, right? That, my blood pressure remained the same. It would have eventually gone down because that's just, again, unresolved and diagnosed insulin resistance will eventually also turn to that. And some people start with that.
Yeah.
But the thing is that this is what's destroying the population. And each one of these things, through just changing your diet, is 100% resolved. And I'm just going to add one more caveat to that and then throw it back to you. And then I want us to also talk about, just insulin testing, home IR, the Kraft test, and different other things. But with this, when you do a lifestyle of carbohydrate restriction and you allow your body to come back into its native metabolism, the one that every baby has been born in since the beginning of humanity, and it's called ketosis. It's not a fearful word. It's actually the metabolic state that the body does the most healing in. I know that's open for some debate in some of the healthcare world, but I think if you take a look at the literature and what's going on with the case studies and the studies across the world, you can't really argue it. But the fact of the matter is, one of the things that I believe is also where primary care went so wrong is that whether you're a dietitian, an RN, or an MD, you are all taught to fear the word ketosis because you've only been taught one side of the coin, of the ketogenic coin. You're taught that, well, if you're a type 1 diabetic and you're completely uncontrolled, there's a condition called ketoacidosis where somebody's ketones go completely crazy, and it's because the pancreas can't create any of the insulin that's needed, and it can be a deadly consequence for a patient suffering from ketoacidosis. Never in the literature or in the curriculum are people being taught that this is the natural human physiology, that until we all Coca-Cola'd and cookied and ice creamed our way out of this native metabolism and turned to second metabolism that we'll refer to as sugar burner, that this, and then you're on that blood sugar roller coaster and maintaining and growing the insulin resistance inside of the body, that this is where it all really stems from. So it takes about 5 to 6 weeks, depending upon how metabolically healthy somebody is, to flip their metabolism back. But when I'm working with people as a coaching standpoint, to me, it's really the number one goal that we shoot for. Let's get you back into your native human species appropriate metabolism. And I'll shut up from there and you can play off of that, or we can go into where you were finishing your point when I cut you off on metabolic syndrome. But take it, we'll go where we go.
Let me go back to that just to wrap that up. But my point that I was trying to make was that, Peter Attia, for example, once stated that in a tweet or on his blog or wherever, a podcast, that the modern lipid problem can't be solved by nutrition. But what we've just been talking about with the dominant lipid problem being metabolic, what I'm saying is that the modern lipid problem requires that nutritional context, and nutrition is the lipid problem. And I think that that's super important. But it's largely ignored. You get a lipid panel and all they focus on is the LDL without any context whatsoever. And we all know that, the majority of ApoB or LDL abnormalities are just wrapped up in metabolic dysfunction. The other, you mentioned ketoacidosis, and I'll just talk about that from the standpoint of the balance between insulin and energy intake, right? And I mentioned that earlier, where you can't, it's unlikely to be successful if you go hypocaloric, but your insulin's through the roof, right? So you have that mismatch. type 1 diabetics have the opposite mismatch. And that's why they are vulnerable to ketoacidosis, is they have no insulin, right? So they can eat as much energy as they want, and they will not gain weight. So again, just emphasizing the importance of the hormonal milieu that is present and works with the energy intake and energy expenditure as well. That third point I'd like to see changed relates to how we view data, right? I think that we've got the modern medical wheelhouse is captured by evidence base and RCTs, and that's all that matters. And we all know that RCTs are basically pharmaceutical tools, right? And you hear this constantly, that anecdotes are always bashed. N=1 are silly. We have evidence. We have large outcome trials. Outcome trials will always trump your little anecdote, and they mean nothing. As if the anecdote is a black swan. I am not unique, and I 100% believe that today, that my problem, my early coronary disease, is not a unique thing. I mean, yeah, maybe I've got some nuances here and there that would be different, within a population of people. But I think the biggest mistake that individuals can make is getting recommendations from your healthcare provider that are population health based, right? It has nothing to do with you as an individual. That's why so many individuals end up with the wrong treatment, because it's not based on that individual. It's based on a population health guideline. And it irks me to no end when N=1 cases and anecdotes are poo-pooed as completely not valuable. And that's just wrong. It's just wrong. They are valuable. And what happened to me is an extremely important message. Like, I am a direct refutation of the LDL is causal of atherosclerosis independent of context. I've had an LDL and an ApoB in the toilet for 25 years.
Put that in context. About what, for the last 25 years, your LDL hasn't been above what?
50. It hasn't been above 50. It's been in the 30s and 40s.
And that's because you've been on a statin for that period of time since you got out of med school.
Yep. But it's always been compositionally abnormal, and it's always been in the setting of undiagnosed insulin resistance. Now, whether that was
Can I quick, because you just use compositionally abnormal, which, if somebody gets an NMR test, and there's all this fractionization that we can do of looking at things, but that's what he means when he says that.
Yeah, it's just a composition. LDL is not just one particle. There's many different types, and you can break it down into small dense versus large buoyant. That's one way of breaking it down. But that composition is just a marker. It's a marker of a functioning or not well functioning system, metabolic system.
Like your A1C is a marker of what your last 90 days of eating has been like, because the red blood cells only live for 90 days. And what's going on in your bloodstream right now, this is how your last 90 days of meals look like. Yeah.
And I'm going to give you a quick case description of what I mean when I say individuals need to protect themselves when going into the doctor, because if all you get is recommendations that are based on a population, you may be getting bad information. This was a mid 70-year-old male who came to me with palpitations, but also wanted cardiovascular risk modification, wanted some info about managing cardiovascular risk. 15 years earlier, had a CAC scan that was abnormal, but less than 50. Okay. Was put on a statin at that time, 15 years ago. His palpitations ended up being what we call pre-atrial fibrillation. which means that he has arrhythmias going on in the upper chamber, but they're not actually fibrillatory arrhythmias, but he's headed that way, which again, to me, would be a big sign that he's got insulin resistance. And so when I saw him, his A1C was 5.8. And he had a lipid panel that was very consistent with metabolic dysfunction. The trends that we've discussed, the low HDL, high triglyceride, LDL was actually low, and actually his LDL was this is an important point actually. His LDL was 70, and so I didn't have any earlier A1Cs on him, but he told me it was always normal for years and years and years, and it only recently went up, right? So this is just classic, right? 70-some-year-old guy diagnosed 15 years ago with coronary disease. It's advanced atherosclerosis, even though his CAC is on the lower side. It's still, he's got advanced atherosclerosis. No symptoms of atherosclerosis at all. Statin drives his LDL down to close to, recommended levels, 70. We repeat a CAC, and guess what it is?
Double? Triple?
2,500.
Oh my God, through the ceiling.
Yeah. So I call this case statin-induced atherosclerosis. I'm making a joke, but I mean, one could argue, oh, maybe the statin helped him because he didn't have an MI. But it's a massive point about, and a red flag about, there's so many examples, myself included, of the disease process it has to be due to something else, right? We just oversimplify it. And his disease process was insulin resistance, which he's had all along, and it's been unchecked, and it's just been getting worse slowly. A1C is now in the pre-diabetic range. And that's been driving progression of his atherosclerosis despite the statin treatment and despite having a suppressed LDL. And this is common. I mean, it's incredibly common, and it's missed, right? Because what happens is someone like him goes to see the doctor, and they say your A1C is high or your LDL is high. Well, you need a statin, but nothing else is addressed. No root cause is addressed, and this is what I'd like to see change.
Absolutely. So I don't even think we need to jump. We can save talking about fasting insulin and home IR for another, because that's maybe another whole conversation and topic. But, I'd like us to keep this one kind of short and sweet. We're at the 28-minute mark. I would like to just put a quick plug in there and to play on one thing that you said, that Ryan was just on the Dr. Phil Ovadia podcast recorded this morning to be released soon. And I've been watching Dr. Ovadia for years, and his channel's called with just the letter I, Fix Hearts. That's his channel name. But as he was talking also about statins, and that he's like, if you're on long-term statin, you got a 72% greater chance of being diabetic just from having been on the statin. Forget about your insulin resistance and everything else that could be driving you to diabetes. It's just a result also of being on the statin for that long. And I'm not saying everybody should be off of their statin or nobody should ever go on a statin. That's not the message. You just have to understand some of the good that can come with some of the bad, and maybe some of the good isn't as good as we think it is, because we've never released the early statin trial data. Nobody's ever gotten to review it, and we can do a whole episode on that as well. So, I'll just kind of make an ending statement, then I'll throw the ball to you to put a candle on the top of it. But doctors are not taught all that they need to know to practice primary care, to practice specialty care, because they don't understand the physiologic state of having your metabolism in a ketogenic state. And they think that the only world there is where 95% of the world is in this non-ketogenic state. And we think that what's normal is just having this, or when we look at reference ranges that you take and your blood tests come back with a reference range, you're being compared to an incredibly unhealthy population. So you're normal for being normally unhealthy. It has nothing to do with what health means. Our reference ranges are devoid of actual sanity of what health means, because if 95% of the population is not healthy and the reference ranges are based on the first 20,000 tests that happen at Quest or whatever lab that creates the reference range, it's meaningless. So the doctors aren't given the critical thinking skills because they haven't been trained with all of the knowledge. They're made to fear the word keto and ketosis. They don't understand insulin resistance. If you want to see a deer in headlights, ask your doctor to explain how insulin resistance happens. Would you have been able to explain that 8 years ago? I'll leave it there for me, and I'll throw it back to you, and then you can answer that and add on anything you'd like to wrap up.
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of summarize really quickly and state that, this is about metabolic therapy. This is about identification of metabolic disorder, and it's about metabolic therapy. And metabolic therapy needs to move in the direction of terrain thinking, which is about thinking about the internal environment, and that is our metabolic systems. It's person-focused, it's proactive and preventative, it's whole person health that supports our patients in making the proper nutritional choices. It's about fixing hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. It's about restoring mitochondrial function. Imagine if our societal organizations applied the same vigor of its anti-smoking messages to insulin resistance, what kind of health we could achieve. And
in a year, it would be gone.
Yeah, I mean, public health is an important paradigm, but we need to be having some shifts within that paradigm so that we can actually get public health. And, it's about insulin resistance.
Absolutely. And I am just going to, because I can't ever just shut up, I am going to add one more tidbit onto that. And insulin resistance isn't a diet only scenario. I think diet only plays about 50% into it. Now, yes, it's probably the biggest axe you have, or arrow in your quiver to go attack insulin resistance, but improper sleep in 1 to 2 nights can make you incredibly insulin resistant. Lack of proper sunlight and exposure to the sun. It's perfectly fine, people, and we're going to do other episodes, and I'll do it on my channel more in great detail on why I think sunscreen is probably one of the biggest cons in the world. And another problem, and there's a whole specialty in dermatology, it's got so many things completely upside down. So anyhow, so there's many other factors that cause insulin resistance. The quickest and easiest way to cure it is with diet, figuring out your sleep, figuring out your stress levels. All of those things together, and a couple other anecdotes in there, will factor into where the insulin resistance is. Yep. And now I will give you last word, and I won't say anything other than where they can find other resources.
No, I think we're good. You made some important additions there about root causes of insulin resistance, and it's not just nutrition.
Okay. Well, everybody, thanks so much for tuning in. This is kind of a metabolic minute, we could call it, or a metabolic 34 minutes, and not nearly, not even half of what we did last time. To hear about Ryan's personal kind of health journey and what he did with trying to get on top of his heart disease and my heart disease and metabolic syndrome and arthritis being wiped out with metabolic therapy, tune into our previous podcast. If you enjoyed this, please hit the like and subscribe button if you're not already a subscriber to the channel. And all that happens is in the notifications when you're on YouTube, there's a little red bell up at the top. It doesn't ding. It just lets you know that there's a new video from us that you can watch. And please share with anybody who you think could benefit from this knowledge. So everybody, Brett Smith and Dr. Ryan Cooley, thanks for joining us at the Metabochondriacs, and we hope to see you again soon.
Bye-bye, everyone.